Are you ready for Thanksgiving? We have so much to be thankful for. Let me ask you, have you been to a wedding lately? Have you paid for a wedding lately? Do you even realize how expensive weddings have become? Here are the latest stats. The typical wedding in these United States costs somewhere between $5,000 and $100,000. That gasp, that's the sound of parents with daughters. Typical wedding costs $28,000. That's the average, $28,000. And regardless of how beautiful everything is and how meticulously everything is planned, so often something goes wrong. For instance, oh, what a memorable wedding! All you have to do is Google colossal fails in weddings and you will be blown away. But this is nothing new. This has gone on since time immemorial because anything that's freighted with this much significance and emotion, there's always the potential for something significant to go wrong. Now, I know you're students of Scripture. And you know that there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you don't, this is exciting stuff. The first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels because they pretty much run in parallel and tell many of the same stories in much the same fashion. It's kind of like reading a newspaper account of an historic event. But then there's the Gospel of John. The last gospel to be written, composed by the beloved disciple, and it's different from the first 3. It's distinctively different. It is more theological, more insightful, more of a glimpse behind the scenes into the heart and thinking of the key characters in this divine narrative. If Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the newspaper account, then John is more of an editorial page. Yes, he tells us the historic events, but he gives us the understanding as to why. And here's what's so fascinating. The first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, begin with a sermon, which somehow seems appropriate. And John's Gospel begins with a wedding where there's a colossal fail, where something goes wrong. It's so interesting that Jesus' ministry is inaugurated in the Gospel of John with a wedding feast where they ran out of wine. Can you imagine how embarrassing that would have been then and now? And yet it creates an opportunity for us to truly see the Son of God, Jesus the Christ. Now, we've been doing this preaching series, Soul Food, and haven't Pastor Ryan and Pastor Chris done a brilliant job setting this all up, talking about the bread of life? Don't you think? They've done just superb work. And it falls to me, I'm the lucky one, because I'm not talking about soul food, I'm talking about what God delivers with it. I'm talking about the wine from the wedding feast at Cana of Galilee. Come on, let's go to the text. This is great stuff, and I'm excited to bring you here. We're in the Gospel of John. We're in the 2nd chapter. This isn't exactly where the gospel begins. This is where Jesus' ministry begins, right here. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was also invited to the wedding with his disciples. Now, a wedding was a communal affair, and family would have had a crucial role. Jerome, writing from Nazareth in some of his letters, said that Cana was within sight. He was writing in the 4th century. So Mary was there. No mention of Joseph. The presumption is that he had already died by the time Jesus began his earthly ministry. Mary's there and has some responsibility. Watch what happens. when the wine ran out. Now, this is startling because the wine can't run out at a Jewish wedding. It just cannot. That would be horrifying to the hosts. This would have been a celebration that lasted days, and to run out of wine would have been scandalous, embarrassing. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Isn't that a fascinating interaction between a Jewish mother and her son? Seriously? And we misinterpret because the translation of the English from the Greek misleads us. When Jesus said woman, he doesn't, there's no disgust or harshness or coldness in that. When you look at the original Greek, woman is a bad translation. It would be more like, my dear, or mom. You get the tone? Mom. What does this have to do with me? And she ignores exactly what Jesus said. Isn't that typical for a mom? She ignores what he says and says to the servants, "Hey, do whatever he tells you to do." Now watch, because this is where it really gets fascinating. Now John tells us there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now, draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." He said, in essence, take it to the psalm. So they took it, and when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." Think about this. Just think about the significance of this. The 6 water jars, which would have held 30 gallons, totaled 180 gallons of water that became wine, and not just ordinary wine. When the wine steward tasted the wine, he was anticipating $2 Chuck from Trader Joe's. Okay? And he tastes it and he's blown away. And he goes, "Oh my goodness, you're serving Opus One, $500, $600, $700 a bottle. No, I can't believe it." And John explains it to us. This, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Do you? Because soul food alone doesn't come close to what God intends, because God offers soul food served with the wine of Cana. And when we experience it, as you did today, when you came forward and received the elements and heard spoken, the body broken, the blood shed for you, you had a taste that was intended to open your eyes so that you'd see who Jesus truly is. And who is Jesus? Let's walk through this. Let's unpack it, because this is really the heart of the gospel. Jesus is the Lord of joy. He is the Lord of life and joy. And it ought to show. It's so interesting. Jesus was called a drunkard and a glutton by his opponents. Why? Because he loved the feast and he loved to share the wine. And there was a sweet intoxication that had nothing to do with alcohol and everything to do with the Spirit of God that imbues the Spirit. Any fans of old movies? Yeah. What's the best old Christmas movie in your opinion? It's a Wonderful Life. I love that movie. It's a little long, a little dark at times. Any others? Christmas Story, I love that. Putting His Eye Out. Any others? Home Alone, good one. Die Hard, good one. Doesn't qualify as a classic, sorry. But fun idea. No, I think one of the very best is The Bishop's Wife with Cary Grant. Anybody remember this? If you have not seen it of late, watch it this year, please, before Christmas, because I think it's magnificent. And it's not only the interplay in terms of socioeconomic times. This was made during the Great Depression. Watch it. It's that good. But the characters are magnificent. Cary Grant is brilliant as the angel. But one of my favorite characters is Monty Woolley, who plays Professor Wuthridge. And he was a skeptic. And he wasn't sure about God. And he had this encounter with the angel. And the angel touched his bottle of port or Madeira and transformed it. It never ran dry. And he offers a commentary, the professor, and says it's the most exquisite, extraordinary wine imaginable. Because you drink it, but you're never intoxicated. You are instead inspired. Empowered. And that's exactly what the wine of Cana is intended to do. You see, Paul routinely tells us that we are not to get drunk on alcohol. We are to be intoxicated, and that's the term he uses. We are to be intoxicated by the Spirit of God's love that stirs our souls, and it ought to be evident and obvious to the world. Anybody remember when Dana Carvey did the church lady on Saturday Night Live? Any pastor or their wife will tell you how painful that was to watch. Because it was so true so often. It would make me cringe. And here's the question, why is it, among all the world, when we have the most to be grateful to God and excited and joyous about, do we go through life like we are dour church ladies, angry and frustrated? It's got to break God's heart. I always go back to Mahatma Gandhi, who said, I would be a Christian if not for Christians. Because the joy, the Lord of life, it's got to show. But He isn't just the Lord of life. Jesus is the Lord of creation. Jesus is the one who turned the water into wine. Jesus is the one who was always doing these miracles. Jesus was the one who was with God before there was anything else other than God. Jesus is the one who was part of the process of creating all the earth, separating the light and darkness from the water and the firmament. Jesus is part of the creative energy that just stirs our souls. And the wedding of Cana is just one of many examples. One of my favorite is, of course, John's telling of the feeding of the 5,000. You remember that story? Jesus turns to the disciples and he says, in essence, this is paraphrased by Preissig, but he says to the disciples, hey guys, we have all these people. How are we going to feed them? And they laughed at Jesus. They laughed at him. The disciples could be real idiots. Mark makes that very clear, okay? I mean, I'm not making fun of the disciples. I'm telling you, Mark makes it clear that they weren't always swift on the uptake. And then Philip, you got to love Philip because he had a sense of humor. He turns to Jesus and he says, hey, got this kid here. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. How's that for a start? And everybody must have laughed. They thought it was hilarious. And then Jesus takes and blesses and makes something magnificent. Because Jesus is at work in all the circumstances of life. Now be really clear, we are not Presbyterian and we certainly are not Baptist. We don't believe that all is foreordained and we just simply go through the motions of living life and there is no free will. We believe there is ultimate, complete free will. Now God is omniscient and so He knows all things and He knows what's going to happen, but we choose. And sometimes we choose wrong, horribly wrong. And we cause some of our worst problems, not only for ourselves, for people we love. But God does not ever abandon us to it. God is at work through it. Romans 8:28, one of my crucial memorized texts. In all things, God works for the good for those who love him. And when I'm facing the toughest times in life, I am praying, okay, God, please, please show me how you are at work in the midst of all of this. Because God is the creative genius that is the good in the universe, that is touching our hearts and leading us to a life of genuine blessing. And what should blow our minds is, not only is he the Lord, the creative Lord, he is the Lord of abundance. Let's go back to the wedding feast. That's so cool and so much fun anyways. I mean, we have 180 gallons of wine. What does that translate into in terms of bottles? Because your typical bottle that you're going to find in Hy-Vee is 750 milliliters, okay? And how many of those can you make out of 180 gallons of wine? The answer would be a little north of 900 bottles of wine. Isn't that just staggering? Doesn't that just blow your mind? And on top of that, think of the feeding of the 5,000 when Jesus started with 5 loaves and 2 fish and he gathered up 12 baskets of leftovers. Sounds a little like Thanksgiving, you know? There are all this abundance. Here's my problem with Christians. We think too small. We dream minusculely because we think and plan within the scope of our own ability. And we are so hesitant to ever take a true step of faith and to leap beyond what we are able to accomplish by ourselves. Anybody hear of Jeff Bezos? Oh, come on, stay with me. If you fall asleep now, you're going to miss the best part of the sermon, okay? Jeff Bezos, you've heard of him, right? You may not respect how he lives his life, and I would agree with that. But what's most amazing is, I think he's the second wealthiest person in the world, and he started in his garage. There he is, younger, much younger, and there's his original garage where Amazon was launched. Would anyone then have ever imagined what the reality is now? God did, because God sees potential where we do not. And God sees the potential for greatness where we cannot imagine it exists. Let's go back 20 years. 20 years. Any of you were part of the summit 20 years ago and were part of our Thanksgiving dinner then? You'd arrive at church and Shirley Schaeffler was sitting at a desk. She was a delightful older soul, and she'd give you a scrap of paper, and you'd go downstairs, and you'd make the beans, or you'd do the corn, or you'd help with the stuffing, and people would bring in turkey and stuffing and things, and we'd mix it all together. We'd mix the good with the bad so people couldn't tell what was good or bad. Come on, I'm just being real straight with you. And we'd serve about 200 people, and we thought we had hit it out of the park. And we did. But it was a very small park. A very small park. Flash forward 20 years. Are you with me? Yesterday, because of a week long of effort, packing all sorts of stuff. We should have pictures from yesterday. It's probably too soon, isn't it? Maybe next service. But we actually packed up boxes of groceries and turkeys, and hundreds of people picked them up and delivered them, and we will serve over 3,300 people Thanksgiving dinner this Thanksgiving. Does that blow your mind? Now let me put it in perspective so you get the glimpse. We live in Lee Summit, Missouri, and the population is about 102,000, and about 4.5% of that population lives below the poverty line. And we fed 3,300 plus. Do you know what that means? We fed better than 3/4 of the people living in poverty. And what would our goal be for next year? Over 4,000 people served. In fact, anyone who is hungry, to make sure that they know this church cares and is for them. Isn't that a dream worthy of the abundance of God? This is where you say yes. This is where we say yes to God. Because above all else, Jesus is the Lord of life. And that's what changes everything. That's why this was the inaugural event in the Gospel of John that allowed people to see. Because you put yourself back 2,000 years ago at the wedding where they ran out of wine, and Jesus shows up and we ran out of wine and he turns water into wine. What would the people have said then? Would they have been like, oh, how cool is this? We have 900 bottles of wine? No. They would have perceived what we might otherwise miss because they knew their Old Testament better than we do. That's the simple truth. And they could have gone to Amos or Jeremiah, but they probably would have thought immediately of Isaiah 25. And they probably would have looked at each other and said, what does this mean? And someone would have quoted from the text, on this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of wine on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of wine on the lees, well refined. Because for Isaiah, the water turned to wine was a clear and obvious sign that the Son of God has come into the world. Not just then, now. And not just for them, for you. So I have to ask you a litmus test. And pretend pretend no one else is around. And it's just you and me, and we're sitting in a comfortable place. And I have to ask, who's the Lord of your life? Because no one is not an option. There's no vacuum there. If Jesus isn't the Lord of your life, then something else is. It's that simple. And if you tell me that it's Jesus, I have to ask, does it show? Does it show in your life? Is your life one where the joy is irrepressible because you know you are loved by God and He defines who you are and He's the one that claims you as His own? Is your life a life of creativity? Well, that doesn't mean you're an artist. It means that you're looking for creative ways to respond to all the challenges and issues that are so much a part of our culture today. Is your life a life of abundance, or are you focused on scarcity? Are you always fearful that God is going to run out, or you will? Or are you thinking that the creative God we worship will find creative ways to create an abundance again? And your life, when people look at you, do they get a glimpse of the church lady or Jesus? My prayer is that when you came forward to receive the elements of communion today, you made a choice. You chose to follow Jesus and to find life. Because that's the only reason we exist as a church. And it makes us different than any other organization in the world. Because we want you to have a good taste of the soul food, the bread of life, and the wine. The wine from the wedding at Cana of Galilee. Will you pray with me, please?